Hello and welcome to the Quincy Access Television studios. I'm Mark Crosby. Thank you for joining us for State View, a program that looks at Beacon Hill and what's going on there and how it affects you here living in, well, I should say, Senator, with the senator from the Norfolk and Plymouth District, Senator Keenan. I was going to say how it affects you in the towns of the city of Quincy, the towns of Rockland, Holbrook, Braintree, and Abington, correct?
Correct.
And there may be more.
There may be more, yes.
But welcome.
Great to be here.
Great to have you. Information that we shared today, certainly relevant to a lot of folks.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about, as I mentioned and hinted to, you may be adding to your palette. Let's talk about the new legislative districts.
Sure. So every 10 years, the legislature is required to do redistricting based on the updated census figures. And there's a committee that's formed, a House committee, a Senate committee, then they act as a joint committee as well. And so they look at the Commonwealth and decide what they have to do in terms of meeting the requirements of district size. And in very basic ways, for the Senate, what they do is they take the total population and divide it by 40 and come up with a target number for each district. Because population declines in certain parts of the state and increases in other, that makes the job a little bit more complicated. Western Mass population declined, so that pushed the western senators east, and that then compressed all the other districts. So in working through that, it ends up that the Norfolk and Plymouth district will change. They're presently consist of Quincy and Abington, Braintree, Rockland, and Holbrook. And I have about 9 precincts. I have 9 precincts in Braintree presently. That will drop to 3 precincts, and I will pick up the town of Hanover. And when I say I mean the Norfolk Plymouth district. Obviously, for me to represent them, I will have to run for office in the new Norfolk and Plymouth district. But that's what the district will look like for the next election.
I know just in the city of Quincy, the numbers based on the last census, up over 100.
Yeah, that's the biggest part of the district, no doubt. And but one of the issues concerns that I do have a little bit with the redistricting is that, Quincy's a pretty urban setting, and Hanover and other towns are pretty rural, so it's a challenge to balance the needs of each. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, every community kind of has the same interest. They want to get appropriate local aid from the state so that they can fund police and fire and schools and veteran services and senior programs. So all the communities have that in common. And then there is a uniqueness to each community in terms of, for instance, water infrastructure. Quincy's on the MWRA, doesn't have as many water supply concerns as some of the other districts, which are dealing with local water supply issues, PFAS, and things of that nature. So overall, I'm excited about how the district will look. I'm excited about representing the district, having the opportunity to represent the district, and we'll see how things go in the election, and hopefully I'll be back as the senator for the Norfolk and Plymouth district.
I mentioned Quincy. I'm going to mention Braintree right now because they just received a $138,000 grant from the Mass DEP.
Yes, so a lot of the communities are getting these grants, and in Braintree, the DEP grant, the one I think you're referring to might be for the Manattaquit River.
Yes.
We've been focused on that for the last couple of years. We've worked with the mayor's office when it was Mayor Sullivan, and now with Mayor Kokoris and the councils down there to get funding basically to make sure that the water quality in the river is maintained, that any minor dam structures that are inhibiting the flow of fish are taken care of, that the kind of the watershed area around the river is preserved. And so we're doing that with the Manattaquit. And then the other thing that DEP is involved with, this is the water quality issue in the town of Braintree. Braintree and Holbrook are part of the Tri-Town Water District, and they are in the process of designing and then ultimately building a new water treatment facility. And there are some issues associated with that. So DEP is busy in many of the towns.
In Rockland and Abington, $2.5 million for joint waterworks.
Yes, so Rockland and Abington, same thing, a little bit further south, but they're working on their water supply. And so what that grant will do is 2 things. One, directly related to water. It will allow them to drill an additional well to help with the supply in the town. And it doesn't address necessarily the PFAS concerns down there directly, but it is a step forward. And then it also helps clean up a contaminated site. So that funding is really critical for those two communities.
I'm just now reading a book about the Quabbin.
Oh, yes.
And the towns that were flooded, and basically to create the reservoir to give water to Boston. Interesting story there.
Yeah, it's fascinating. How lucky are we that we have the Quabbin Reservoir? I mean, the water quality here in those communities that utilize the MWRA is some of the best in the country. We've addressed, but still addressing the sewage issue through the MWRA. But we're very fortunate that back then they had the foresight to build the Quabbin Reservoir. And it wasn't an easy political decision. You basically said to a few towns, we're going to basically flood you forever.
4 towns ago.
Yes, forever. And supposedly, if you go down there and dive at the Quabbin, you can see the remains of some of these towns, which is pretty interesting. But the watershed area around it, the infrastructure that was put in place, the fact that it's basically gravity fed from the Quabbin to eastern Massachusetts, it's remarkable. And as you see other parts of the country struggling with water needs, Massachusetts, and particularly eastern Massachusetts, is really fortunate.
And I think back in the day, because we're talking about 1920, 1938, I think is when it was completed, that was a sizable project.
Sure.
A sizable project, I believe, even in the country.
Yeah, and you wonder if there'd be the political ability to put a project like that together now, to put something in place. We had one of similar scale, I would suggest, on the Big Dig, and one of similar scale in relative to sewerage, the cleanup of Quincy Bay and Boston Harbor, and the construction of the Deer Island treatment plant. Those are sizable projects. And the goal of the infrastructure bill that's made its way through the process in Washington is to make those type of investments for the next generation and the generations to come.
Let's talk I'm talking about reading and education. Let's talk about education and education about genocide and a bill related to that.
Yes, so Senator Rodericks, who's from the Fall River area, filed a bill that it was genocide education bill, and I co-sponsored the bill, and the purpose of the bill was to provide information and curriculum to students in our public schools about the genocides that have occurred throughout history. There was a poll that was done, a survey that was commissioned by the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, and it gauged Holocaust awareness and knowledge, and found that 63% of millennials and Generation Z populations did not know that 6 million Jews perished during the Holocaust. And
that's a high percentage.
That's a very high percentage. And in the long spectrum of history, it's not that long ago that it happened. And young people today are unaware of it. I, many years ago, went over to Dachau, to one of the concentration camps, and it was one of the most moving experiences of my life. It was just incredible, and that people don't understand that, or aren't willing to acknowledge that it occurred, or are unaware of that. It's really alarming, and we just have to make sure that people are aware so that we never experience it again in the world.
We made that trip with our son, who was 17, just turned 17 at the time, and he was studying that period of history, and he was moved. We were all moved by being in that location.
Yeah. And there have been other genocides throughout our history.
Absolutely.
And again, the idea is that the better we are at educating young people about it, hopefully the better we are at preventing it from occurring again.
I want to move now to flavored tobacco and the ban here in the state, and the industry challenges, the tobacco industry challenges to that ban.
So we passed first-in-the-nation legislation that basically banned flavored tobacco products here in Massachusetts. And it was prompted by a young generation that was saying they were being targeted. We were seeing particularly vaping products proliferate within our schools, causing all kinds of problems socially and educationally and health-wise for young people. And so they reached out and asked if we would file legislation to ban flavored tobacco products. There had been an effort back in 2009 at the federal level, and it had succeeded to a degree. It was before vaping products were on the market, and it had banned flavored cigarettes, except for menthol. The industry went down there and lobbied extensively to keep menthol on the market. So fast forward, flavored vaping comes into play. Young people are attracted. They're intentionally targeted by the industry.
Because what are some of these flavors?
Oh, there's bubble gum, there's cherry, menthol, all kinds of different flavors. And they're all designed to attract young people. And it was incredibly successful. Vaping rates went through the roof. So we responded with this legislation. We got it passed, the first in the nation, and now the industry is trying to push back with several pieces of legislation that would take out timelines that we have in place, that would exempt certain products, and they're going to keep coming at us, but the numbers are encouraging. We're seeing the youth use of tobacco products decline. There's been some concern about loss of revenue. We pretty accurately predicted what the loss of revenue would be initially. And there was an expectation as we banned it, people would go to New Hampshire, would go to Rhode Island, and go to Connecticut, and that did occur. People were buying the products there. Our sales revenue went down. The sales revenue in those states went up. And now we're seeing the sales revenue from tobacco products in New Hampshire dropping down to pre-law levels, and the same in surrounding states. So we believe it's having a pretty significant impact. And the long-term impact on public health is where we will see the most savings in terms of dollars, and then also in terms of saving lives.
Now, you mentioned the ban first in the nation. Who else nationwide is considering?
New York has legislation. I think Washington, D.C. has legislation. West Coast has legislation. A couple of the states out in the West Coast. So several are exploring it. And there's been more activity at the federal level where they are looking at these various products and making a determination of whether there's a role for them. One of the issues is on vaping is it a product that can help people transition from combustible or traditional cigarettes? We believe it can, and that's why we did not ban vaping. We left it so that vaping products can be sold, but non-flavored. So if somebody wants to transition from combustible cigarettes to what many perceive to be a safer alternative, they can still do that in Massachusetts. The industry wants to open it up again and say, well, let's get flavors back. We'll draw more people from combustibles. But the science and the data just don't support that position.
Just wonder how many adults would be interested in bubble gum flavor. I mean, you just wonder.
Yeah, I'm not sure many. And our sense is if you're looking to transition from combustible cigarettes, which are tobacco flavored now, then go to a tobacco flavored vaping product if you believe that that's going to be healthier. Do you really need those flavors? And if you do, then we lost all sense of balance because the flavors really were what were targeted at young people. And you know, the reports have shown they were purposely targeted at young people, particularly by Juul. They had a choice to make at one point. It was pretty stark. Target to a certain audience of older people or target young people. And they decided to target young people.
I was listening to the radio just the other day, yesterday I believe, coming here to work, and there was discussion about the opioid crisis.
In Massachusetts, I think as much as we could be, I don't think anybody was truly ahead of the curve in dealing with the opioid crisis, but we were responding more quickly than most other states. We were passing legislation that was showing to be quite impactful. Our overdose death rates were dropping. Overdoses in general were dropping. Fentanyl came along and changed that dynamic, but we were still doing well compared to other states. And that was because we had programs in place for prevention, treatment, short-term and long-term recovery, and we also had harm reduction programs in place. The pandemic came along, and I think the most detrimental impact of the pandemic relative to opioids, the opioid crisis, was that people were cut off from treatment. They were cut off from office-based treatment in many cases. They were cut off from access to medication-assisted treatments. They were cut off even from AA programs and those types of options. And they were isolated. And their use continued and more prone to overdose when you're by yourself, particularly an overdose death. And we saw that. So we're working really hard to connect people again to the services that are available, and hopefully we'll see those numbers turn down again. It's really a terrible, terrible situation.
Talk about opioids and the importance of healthy mental health.
There is a direct connection, and I draw it. I remember many years ago I went out to Framingham State Prison where a woman who had been what they call sectioned, had been subject to a Section 35 process and sent off because they were considered to be harmful to themselves or others because of their drug use. They went off to Framingham State Prison, which was not an appropriate place to provide treatment for substance use disorder. And I remember talking with the people who provided the treatment out there. They said, you can detox somebody, you can get them through the initial stages of treatment and clinical stabilization. They said, once you reach that stage, all the mental health issues that somebody has just come rushing to the surface. And so there really is this pretty direct correlation between mental health and substance use and vice versa. And so you really have to treat the whole body. If you don't address mental health issues early on, it can lead to a sense of isolation, a need for self-medication, which turns people towards opioids. And so they're directly connected. We just passed in the Senate a comprehensive mental health bill, and we worked on putting amendments in there to make that connection throughout that bill. We were successful in some areas, and other areas we'll work on it when a comprehensive substance use bill comes forward, hopefully this spring, and we're working with our colleagues to push that bill forward.
As we talk about drugs, let's continue on that line and talk about the drug stewardship program about to expire.
Yeah, so we were successful several years ago in passing legislation that made opioid manufacturers responsible for the take-back of unused medications. They produce them. They make a lot of money in producing the medications. The medications are prescribed. They're paid for by people through their insurance, through copays, through deductibles, and yet oftentimes the full prescription goes unused. So the pharmaceutical company in the meantime has made the money off of it. So we believed that they should be responsible for taking back unused medications. We passed one of the first programs in the country to require opioid manufacturers to come up with a program and working with the Department of Public Health to take back those medications. We were successful in getting it passed in the Senate. It went over to the House. Ultimately, the final version had what they call a sunset clause, that it would be in place for a certain period of time and then it would expire. So we were successful in one attempt of getting that extended. It does expire this December 31st. We would like to make it permanent, but we are at this point seeking another 5-year extension. The program's in place. It's taking back over 5,000, I don't know if it's tons of pounds, whatever it may be. It's taking back a lot of medications. And those medications, if they're not taken back through this program, would be in medicine cabinets, in kitchen cabinets, subject to being accidentally ingested by children, accidentally taken in too large quantities by adults, or diverted from the home into the illicit drug stream. So taking them back is very important, and we're going to keep pushing that legislation.
Before we leave the topic of drugs, I do want to mention something in relation to the collection of data.
Yes. So again, we passed a first-in-the-nation data collection law in Massachusetts, become a national model, and what we designed the legislation to do was to basically inform us on policy. And the idea came to me one time when I was down at the morgue in Boston, and I thought there was several John and Jane Does lying in the morgue, unidentified, who had died of opioid overdoses. And I thought, if we could figure out where they were the day before, and the week before, and 6 months before, that information would be very valuable to us. So we passed Chapter 55, which allows all the many data sets in the Commonwealth to interact. So if that person was in a morgue, we may know that the day before, through our all payer claims database, that they were in an emergency department. We may know that a week before that they were released from a correctional facility. We may know that 6 months before that they were in court on a substance issue, and we could use all that data. So, and it's informed us in policy in a lot of different ways. But one of the pieces that we want to add is to have socioeconomic data in there, information from the Department of Revenue. And this is not person-specific information. This is de-identified information that helps the policymakers determine what policies are needed to address bigger problems. Just quickly, we knew, for instance, that people coming out of our correctional facilities were at a heightened risk of dying of a drug overdose. And everybody thought, oh, if I could, maybe they'll get treatment in there. And our correctional facilities really do a good job with treatment. But people come out, they're at risk of overdose. And so we put in place policy for medication-assisted treatment, expansion of that within our correctional facilities. We've dealt when women are expecting, when they are pregnant, we put policies in place because the data showed us that was an area of concern as well. So we get all that information from this program. We want to make it as comprehensive as possible by adding socioeconomic data as well.
Recently, there was an election in Boston, and Michelle Wu is now the mayor of the city of Boston. One of the things that she's addressing is the methadone mile and the folks that are using and are camping out in Boston.
Yeah, that's a difficult problem. I have spent over several years a fair amount of time down there and in other areas similar to that across the country and in North America. I have seen areas like that. I've visited them on my own up in Montreal. I've been down to Philadelphia and seen a similar neighborhood. I've been out to Vancouver, which struggles with the issues, similar issues. So it really comes down to, I think, a few things. One is providing access to mental health services to people so that they don't end up in a situation like exists over in Melnia Casa, Mass Ave neighborhood. So mental health is enormously important, mental health services. Housing is incredibly important. There are some people there who can't go into a shelter because they're actively using drugs, and so they have no place to go but to live on the streets and ultimately to use tents to live there. So we've got to figure out a way to kind of stabilize them and get them into some sort of housing, and that increases the likelihood that they will get treatment or that their issues with addiction will be addressed in some way and that they won't spiral down further. I've visited many programs in Boston where they have what they call supportive housing. And some of them are on some of the nicest side streets in the city, and people really don't even know that they're there. And they're these 300-400 square foot efficiency units, pretty small, and people move into them and they see their lives stabilized. They may not be ready for employment immediately, but their lives are stabilized. They're not in the emergency department. They're not sleeping in tents on the street. So we've got to look at mental health, providing housing, and then just access to addiction treatment services.
I know one of the items that she'll have to address too is Long Island and the Long Island Bridge. For years, there was a treatment center located there.
Yeah, I visited those treatment centers on at least 2 or 3 occasions before they shut down. There was different ones that were out there. And I think that has contributed to some degree to what we're seeing over at Melnia Casa and Mass Ave. But the idea of spending $90 to $120 million on a bridge to access those treatment programs, that's, in my mind, $90 to $120 million that we could use more immediately to address the situation and putting treatment programs in more appropriate places. And if the decision is made to use Long Island, then certainly a ferry service could accommodate the need out there. But it's an interesting issue.
We're talking a lot about the mayor of Boston right now, but one of the other issues she'll have to address, which she actually said during a campaign speech, through several campaign speeches, was the MBTA and accessibility and affordability, and potentially making the MBTA free.
The agency is in a pretty good financial situation for the next 2 to 3 years as a result of federal infusion of funds, and also as a result of state commitment to the MBTA and state bond funds that have allowed some of the capital projects to move forward. Those federal funds aren't there forever, so in fiscal year 2023, 24, 25, the challenge is going to emerge again as how to best fund the MBTA and meet some of the projected deficits. So the idea of providing free MBTA service, everybody says that nothing's for free in life. Somebody will have to pay for that. So the challenge is finding the most equitable way to fund public transportation in different regions. Somebody from Springfield isn't going to be too happy about paying for the MBTA in Boston, but they also have regional transit out there, so those things can be addressed. Interestingly, the way the fare system works now, if they made the 214 or 216 free coming out of House Neck, which stops at the top of my street, which I take, because you get a transfer, if I'm taking it to get on the red line, if it was free at the top of my street, it really wouldn't be, because I'd pay the full red line fare as opposed to paying half when I get on the bus, roughly, and half when I get on the train. For somebody who just uses that bus, yes, it would be free, but we'd have to figure out some way to provide that. City of Boston, last time around on one of their pilot programs, allocated $8 million. They didn't spend all of that on it, and so the most recent efforts to expand the free MBTA, particularly bus routes, have met with a little bit of resistance in the Boston City Council. They want to take a step back and make sure that the they're doing it in a way that makes sense economically.
As we end this program, I do want to talk about items that the Housing Committee is addressing. Affordable housing, always front and center,
Yes.
and a specific condo item as well.
Yeah, so we had a hearing a couple of weeks ago on several bills that addressed condominiums. And it's not a topic that draws a lot of attention, but there are issues related to condominiums. When you purchase a condominium, you become part of an association, and you are governed by bylaws of that association. So several of the pieces of legislation attempt to address issues that arise there. One of the pieces of legislation would basically standardize the procedures for elections relative to condominium associations. And it's a pretty extensive set of criteria on what an election would look like to get elected to a condominium association board. Several of the pieces of legislation had to do with the reserves that are required to be kept by a condominium association, making sure that they are of sufficient amount to take care of a roof or windows or whatever may need to be done in the condominium building. So there was a whole lot of different types of bills with the idea of trying to make the process as standardized, open, and transparent as possible, and protecting the rights of those who purchase condominiums, and then also acknowledging that condominium associations have a lot of power, and that has to be make sure that that is addressed and standardized, so again that those who own condos are protected.
We should mention that not only here in the city of Quincy, but throughout your district, a lot of condos are being built.
A lot of condos, a lot of apartments, and as many as are being built, they are not meeting the demand. For instance, the Abbey in North Quincy, which is apartments, it was built during the pandemic, and there was a lot of concern about would people move there because they're not going to work in Boston as much. And from my understanding, that is leasing up very quickly. Peter O'Connell's building in downtown Quincy, my understanding is that may be already fully leased. And so as quickly as they come on, they're being filled. And so it demonstrates there's an enormous need for housing, and we have to address workforce housing, affordable housing, market rate housing, senior housing, veteran housing. The demands are across the board, and it's a tough task, but we're going to have to build. And so building as smartly and appropriately as possible without impacting the quality of lives in our communities is the goal, and it takes a lot of balancing.
In the future, I think we'll address more from the Housing Committee, but
Right.
also more from those other committees that you serve on. And
Right.
For this particular program today, I want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
A lot of information in a half hour.
Sure. Feels like I'm talking a lot, trying to get as much out, but
Better you talk than me. You
No.
have more information to hand out than I do.
and I appreciate the opportunity to share that information. So thank you. You folks do a great job, and I really appreciate it.
And thank you at home for watching. You have been watching a program of Quincy Access Television. Please continue to support your local access station for more programming just like this.